Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Leah Markey, the Director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry Library. I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's installment of Race and Dialogue, a conversation series from our center that features discussions from scholars of pre-modern critical race studies and/or critical Indigenous studies. Our session today will be our first international edition in the series. We're excited about that, and we're honored to have two brilliant book historians with us today, Brandi and Trude Dijkstra, who together cover early modern global book history. We're looking forward to hearing them discuss a bit about the historiography of the field and about new research and development. I believe they'll also speak to us a little bit about their experience teaching race and book history from their very different parts of the globe. So we're putting their websites into the chat momentarily, and we'll also provide info about their publications in the chat during the conversation. And before they begin their conversation, I would like to read the, oh, Chris, you have to change your screen there. Thank you. I would like to read our land acknowledgement. As part of our commitment to addressing the ongoing legacies of dispossession and settler colonialism, as well as our relationships with the city, the land, and the environment, the Newberry Library has crafted this acknowledgement in partnership with the Chicago American Indian Center. Located near the confluence of several waterways, the Newberry Library sits on land that intersects with the Aboriginal homelands of several tribal nations, the Council of the Three Fires, the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Ojibwe nations, the Illinois Confederacy, the Peoria and Kaskaskia nations, and the Maiamia, Wea, Thikiwaki, and Meskwaki nations. The Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Kickapoo, and Mascoutin nations also call the region of Northeast Illinois home. Indigenous people continue to live in this area and celebrate their traditional teachings and lifeways. Today, Chicago is home to one of the largest urban Indigenous communities in the United States, and this land remains an important place for Indigenous peoples. As a Chicago institution, it is the Newberry's responsibility to acknowledge this historical context and build reciprocal relationships with the tribal nations on whose land we are situated. And since this is a virtual event, you all, our panelists and audience members, are joining us from many different parts of the world. Wherever you currently are, we encourage you to know how you may be of service to people on whose lands you're situated, and seek to understand your history that has brought you to some. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Trude and Brandi. Thank you both for being here. We're really excited to learn from you. So we'll take questions from the audience at around 30 to 40 minutes into the conversation, but audience members can feel free to put their questions in the chat at any time. They can use either the Q&A button or the chat, and we will look out for them and gather them together, and I will read them out to you all. So thank you again, Trude and Brandi. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leah. Okay, so if I may, Brandi, ask you a first question, because I'm really excited to talk to you about all this and all the book history. But first, I will, of course, thank you and also everyone at the Newberry for organizing this. It's such a great way of opening up the conversation about race and how we all work on that from different perspectives. And I would like to recommend everyone to go back and watch the previous interviews as well on the YouTube channel, because they're just so great. So Brandi, if I may, so we're both book historians, but that's a very broad field, even though maybe not everyone has heard of that, because at least to me, people are like, okay, what do you do exactly when you do book history? So I was wondering, so maybe you can tell a little bit about how you approach your work and how did you get to this topic and how does book history come in there?
So I guess the way that everything sort of got started for me is that I've always been interested in books as objects and how they got printed, whether or how they were written, if we're talking about manuscript books. And when I was an undergrad, I had the experience of reading an early modern play that only had kind of an older edition, and it still had sort of the signature marks, which means it sort of tells you how a book was put together. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant. I thought it was some kind of a formula. So I went to my professor at the time, who was Heidi Bremen, to her office hours, and I took this book with me and asked her what this formula was. I was like, does it have something to do with the book being put together? And she said, absolutely. Is this something that you're interested in? And I was like, kind of. And from there, it just kind of expanded. And I have just always been interested in readers, in how books are made, how books are printed. And um, somehow, over the course of time, I found myself being really interested in pre-modern critical race studies, mostly because of my reading, initial reading of Kim Hall's book, Things of Darkness, and Imtiaz Habib's book, Black Lives in the English Archives. And there was always something that was sort of like inarticulable about the kind of work that I was interested in. And I suddenly realized that some of the gaps that I was encountering when I was thinking about books and thinking about printing and encountering things was race, whether it was whiteness or whether it was um, any kind of otherness. I realized that that was the particular gap. And because I work on English and mostly English books, most of my encounters with race were either because of metaphors that printers were using, and we can talk about that a bit later. Just to talk about the act of printing is this sort of racialized action, which really surprised me. And the ways that like people approach reading and approach books and approach literacy is always sort of there's always an undercurrent of racial structures that I just hadn't really thought about. And thanks to all of the work that's being done in PCRS and in larger sort of global studies, um, it made me realize that sort of the history that you get, at least in the United States in like fifth grade, I guess you're around like 9 or 10 or 11, you get told the history of printing, and it cuts out everyone from Asia and sort of starts with Gutenberg, and you don't realize that sort of there's this larger history until later. I think things are much different now, and students learn more about printing, hopefully, from a global perspective. But that's kind of how I got started. And of course, I'm going to ask you the same thing because it's really exciting to meet someone from a different part of the world who works on these early books and sort of thinks about the same things, but in a very different way. So how did you get started?
That's, yeah, I just love the fact that you started out with the signature marks because, in a way, that also was the case for me. So, perhaps if people don't know what the signature marks, if you look at any early modern book, there will be these, like you said, sort of formulas, mostly on the bottom right of each page, which is not so much a message for the reader, it's really a message for the binder who had to put the book together. But as you say, they tell you something about how a book is made. And for me, became fascinated with them as well. So sort of looking at them and seeing this formula and what does it exactly mean, and then you go into the whole book history is even a field. So fortunately for me, there is a master's of book history at the University of Amsterdam. So there's a whole study program I could do. So when I found out that was even an option, I was like, okay, this is it. I'm locked in for life. This is what I'm going to do. Fortunately, I was able to because I am now assistant professor in book history. So, so after the first sort of book history exists even as a field, I think that I came to the intersection of what I'm working now through the history, sort of combining the history of knowledge with the history of print. And my earlier research explored how Chinese religion and philosophy were represented in printed works, specifically produced in the Dutch Republic in the early modern period, so between 1595 and 1700. And what I always focus on is, and what I'm fascinated about is how a wide range of media, so a wide range of printed materials like books, like newspapers, pamphlets, and journals, basically tell you a different story through different material features, and which very much shape how early modern readers could encounter Chinese thought specifically. And now I've taken it up a little bit broader. And of course, one of the central findings was that there was no one image, not one singular image of China, but rather a fragmented one that really shifted in its representation between media, between language, between audience, and between ideology. And that by looking at the materiality, you can say something about that. And sort of this previous work has made me more aware and increasingly aware of how much these representations were tied not just to content, but also to material and formal decisions made by those producing these different printed works. How a title page, for example, as you have showed wonderfully in the Race Before Race volume, could frame a subject, and what role an image or the paratext. So the paratext is everything outside of the main text of a book played, or how language and formats, this how large a book was, filtered the unfamiliar into a sort of the legible in early modern Europe. And that had led me toward a more sort of maybe, and I really would like to talk to you about that later, a bibliographical approach. So thinking about how books just don't carry ideas, but how they construct and condition them through their physical form. And that goes for, in my mind, every subject, but very, very much so for race, and maybe even could make it visible in a sense, or at least that would be, I think, what we are both thinking about. So how can this material form of the book, and how looking at how it is produced, for who it was written, who did consume it, if we ever can make sense of that, and who is hidden in that process. So now I'm currently, so the Chinese religion and philosophy was part of my dissertation, and recently I start focusing more on visual and material strategies, like hand coloring, which we'll also talk about later. So how the book as an object can participate in this making of race and difference. So yeah, I think it's great that we get to talk to each other like this.
Yeah, it's fascinating that how early modern people were encountering the world, and these sort of structures of racialized structures that we still think about today. Um, First encounters for many groups of people have to do with books produced from the printing press. And I think that that says a lot, that we are all now more comfortable as scholars and practitioners in the field to admit that there is this kind of structure and thinking about race that underpins the kind of work that we do. So whether it's the fabulous work that I love of yours on the first mentionings of Chinese tea in um, Dutch medical manuals, and sort of how even as people are trying to introduce this non-Western medicine, there's still this sort of layer of this layer in which people are kind of telling you and structuring sort of like how you still need to consider and interpret the use of this medicinal material. Like we still want you to acknowledge, yes, this Eastern medicine is good, but we still want to make sure that Western practices are still kind of the most important. And I think that that also happens in Joseph Moxon in the 17th century in England in The Art of Printing. He actually does mention Chinese printing in the beginning of that late 17th century book. But he immediately dismisses it. And he's like, well, this printing is really great. It does what it's supposed to do, but it's not what essentially Western printing does. and it doesn't sort of articulate the same things. It can't do the same things. And I was really surprised that it wasn't just a, this is what happens with printing over here. This is what happens with printing in England. Instead, we get this immediate comparison where readers are already supposed to acknowledge that Western books are the superior books. I don't know if it's just sort of a thing to get people to buy his
I
book,
don't know, because this
or
is
if it's yeah, or if it's something that, we see today when we get sort of this introduction to printing.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, because this discussion is also happening in the Dutch Republic during the same time. So Simon de Vries, he writes this whole expose on the history of printing as well. Maybe there's a connection with Marxism.
Hmm.
I wonder about that. But Simon de Vries actually concludes that, so he is less sort of the European way is better. There's also the fact that in the Netherlands at the time, the Dutch Republic, people believed that it was actually a Dutchman who invented printing. I think today some people in Haarlem still do, because there's a very large statue of Laurens Janszoon Koster on the main square of Haarlem standing today with a capital A in his hand. So I think if you ask people in Haarlem, they still will tell you, no, 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 it really was a Dutchman. So he makes the argument like, okay, it was the Chinese, it was Gutenberg, it was Laurens Janszoon Koster. We all know it's Koster, of course, Simon de Vries argues, but he sort of nuances it a little bit, because he says, no, it was invented both at the same time.
Hmm.
And he doesn't necessarily, yeah, so it's great that this is apparently, maybe we should look at other languages as well, if this is also a French or a
Absolutely.
Spanish discussion. So lots of people claiming to be the inventors of print, so could be perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, and it does seem that the way that this construction of print is a part of like a construction of like national identity as well. So if we make print or we do these things that are particularly useful to the world, then we need credit for it, which is pretty great. Um, and I wonder like if we looked into like early American printing, which I'm pretty sure does the same thing, is to say we've like made things better. So there's always this need to sort of connect um, the function of print to like the creation of this national culture that at least in the case of England gets really undergirded with like whiteness and how important that is to the
Definitely.
English culture, um,
Yes.
which which is I think it's the problem I think that I will probably be thinking about for the rest of my life. Um, because I don't think that there's an answer to why. There might be an answer to how, but I'm not sure that there's going to be an answer to why. But I I'm really interested in sort of these theoretical problems that we work on. And that's one that I'm wrestling with just a little bit, but I'm really curious about what are the kinds of theoretical problems that you are currently wrestling with.
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's what drives us, right? It drives most scholars. Like, what are you sort of the problems you're encountering now? So recently, I've been mostly looking into how to understand hand coloring, because before 1800, there was no color printing, or there was, but wasn't really distributed on a larger scale. And so every book that was colored had to be done by hand, which makes it much more personal, much more sort of individual copy. Um, Also, the fact that most print work was by its nature black and white. So on the one hand, there's this visual culture, and there earlier Race and Dialogue seminar, the conversations talk about that wonderfully. But to my mind, at least, so this is mostly high art, if you would like to call that. So I wonder how many people would really encounter Rembrandt's etchings or Rubens's painting of Francis Xavier opening up the world to Christianity. So print is black and white, but it does get colored. This also is, of course, a form of epistemic and racial labor in and of itself. Um, how do these early modern books present the non-European world? And color wasn't only aesthetic, it was also doing work. So it was making bodies, it was classifying plants, it was distinguishing between the familiar and the foreign. And yet the people that applied the color, the colorists, were almost always anonymous, and the intentions behind their choices are really undocumented. So how do we read these colors as historical evidence, in this case of race? So what kind of agency can we attribute to the act of coloring in and of itself, mostly done by women? We know that it was mostly done by women and children, maybe also people, non-European people, non-white people. And it's also in literature, in the theoretical framework, it's often sort of secondary to the printed image and the printed text. So can we even speak of a sort of interpretation or a sort of authorship? And how do we talk about race if it's not constructed only on the level of the page, but also in these layers of pigment? So yeah, that's where I'm at now. And I think the answer lies in technical analysis, close visual reading, and bibliographical research, but it's still very much open questions. And that's also what makes it exciting, right? So yeah.
And I also think it connects in a really interesting way to some early modern title pages. And the one that I like to think most about is this play by Thomas Kidd called The Spanish Tragedy. And it had a lot of additions from when it was first performed in like the late 1580s. But in about 1615, there's a there's a in the title page, there's actual sort of a visual representation, possibly, probably, of one of the scenes of the play, and one of the characters has a black face. And that was I think the first time I saw that woodcut, or I think it's a woodcut. The first time I saw it, I stopped in my tracks. I kept the looking at the picture and wondering how on earth this black person ends up in this sort of panoramic kind of scene. It's a pretty violent scene, and I asked a professor at the time, and he said, I don't really think it means anything. E- or maybe it does, I don't know, but it's not, I don't think it's anything you should focus on at this point. Which of course meant that I was going to think about that for a really long time. Um, and the more that I thought about that particular um, image, um, I kept going back to it, and then I went back to the title page, and then I noticed that on the title page, the place, the bookshop where you could buy the book was called the Saracen's Head. So then I was like, wait a minute, we've got this black sort of Saracen-y Muslim looking person who is then somewhat weirdly attached to the bookshop. And I was like, well, is this sort of a really not great play on the bookshop? Is this something that was a product of another book that sort of gets attached to this play? Is this an image that's reminiscent of the stage? And now that I know that there are people in theater history who are starting to track down early modern actors who may have been Black, that has changed everything as well. So it just means that the more we think about these sort of hand coloring, what gets done in print, the relationship that people had to non-white people, if they were non-white themselves, working or participating in this industry, things just keep getting more and more open because we've been willing to start to think about it. Um, you can imagine, like, if we were trying to do this, like maybe even 20 years ago or 30 years ago, we just wouldn't be having this conversation publicly in this way. And I think that that's some of the really exciting part of it, is that once we start to meet each other, we can sit down and talk about what's going on in the Netherlands, what's going on in Britain, And we have, you know, more people who are starting to work on Irish libraries and Scottish libraries and um, non-European, non-Western libraries, so that we can all sort of have this like larger conversation about how are people representing the others, whatever the other is, on in print in these sort of various ways, which is, I think, super exciting. And I'm just glad that there's opportunities for collaboration so that we can talk to one another about this stuff as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're totally right. And it is a sort of very fascinating image you're talking about. So it's in, I think it's in your article, right? That you see this black person suddenly popping up in the illustration in and of itself. It tells you lots as well, right? So this isn't this part, this is part of the sort of first conception of this image. This wasn't color added in later. The engraver at least sort of had a notion of depicting
Mhm.
it like this. Yeah.
Yeah, and there had to be a choice to blacken the face um, after print, or cut it in such a way, in such a
Yeah.
in relief, so that the blackness could be sort of immediately shown, which I think is something that's pretty interesting. And then um, once we get to your work where people are making personal choices, which I think is really exciting, um, about how to um, add color to a scene in various ways. Um, and that allows a lot of it allows us to understand. I mean, I know it's probably a little difficult to tell when people were adding the color, until I think once you do like, what is it, like spectrographic analysis and stuff like that to figure out when these pigments are added. If you can find out if it's sort of coming in the sort of earlier time period, I would love to know if people are thinking about like shades and like different, like, because all skin tone doesn't match. That's not like, there's not like one skin tone for, you know, one group of people. It would be interesting to see if there are people who kind of try to create subtleties in that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's, we do actually, there are some artistic manuals where people talk about color. And there's one at the National Archives in The Hague, which specifically tells about how to color a black man, how to color a yellow Moor. So people do think about that. I also have other evidence from the archives that people are aware of the fact that not everyone is white. But how that translates to the page, that's also one of the fascinating things, I guess, because I came across a couple of engraved title pages where there is, for example, one figure which in different copies is colored differently. So in
Mm,
some cases they are black, in some cases they are more ochre, in some cases they are more whitely depicted. So yeah, and as to the question of when it was colored, it still happens today, right? So people are
yeah.
still coloring in their books. There's this company here in the Netherlands which advertises with "We will color your 16th century books," and they do, and it isn't illegal, I guess, but maybe it should be. So you never know. And then, of course, is the question if what kind of pigments are used, and why are people coloring in now? Is it to sort of uh, make it appear as if it's a 16th century book? So coming across a pigment like lead white wouldn't necessarily tell you anything. You can still buy that if you want to.
Right.
So. Yeah, so I'm now in talks with the Rijksmuseum to see if we can do some sort of technical analysis, but it's less part of the, and that's also what I think is very interesting, is less part of the earliest conception of the image, like with your title page, where it is very obvious that the engraver, the draws person conceived of this from the beginning. And I think this maybe brings us into the territory of bibliography. So I'm really interested in sort of what do you consider book history, and sort of how do you think the field should move a bit maybe towards, because you wrote a wonderful article in the um, Oxford Handbook of Book History in England, if I'm saying that correctly. Sorry,
Yeah,
I
I
don't
think
know
so,
the
yeah.
pronunciation. And it was what I really liked about it, it is that it not so much only sort of gave this cultural historical perspective. So if you want to divide book history traditionally in the sort of the French perspective, which comes more from cultural history, and
Mhm.
the British perspective, the Anglophone perspective, which comes more from analytical bibliography. And I really like that you questioned the bibliographical part of that, because it seems so ingrained into what we are doing that I didn't even question it. Because as you mentioned rightly, it has such an air of objectivity, but it
Mhm.
doesn't. And your article really made me realize that. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that if you
Sure.
may.
I joked recently that I have a love-hate relationship with the new bibliographers. So that includes people like W. Gregg, who were working in the 1920s and 1920s through 1950s in England, who did a lot of work to try to establish bibliography and sort of the technical study of books and the technical study of like print into this very scientific uh, discourse, one that I've recently tried to suggest maps the rise of quantum physics and quantum mechanics in like Cambridge and Oxford um, and um, in Europe um, because there's a similar rhetoric about sort of these the claims in it, that the work that we're doing, whether it's in physics or and you're trying to figure out what the function of an atom is, what the function of a proton is very similar to the work that people like Greg were doing, who are like, what's the function of print? How do we understand um, the nature of um, the printing of a book in these sort of heightened scientific terms? And that is something that I hadn't really thought about until I started spending a lot of time rereading all of these things that I'd read as a graduate student, was like, oh, that's just all true. I'm just going to go ahead and accept that there's such a thing as a copy text. There's such a thing as the right way to do this work. And then once I sat back and started looking at the metaphors, I was like, wait a minute, this sounds like we are trying to invent a history of print that is sort of retrospective and is one that as you know, when you study the history of any kind of printed book, there's more questions than answers all the time. You look at something and you're like, I don't really know. And I think that for a lot of folks, whether they were working in quantum mechanics or working in new bibliography, unknowns were really, really uncomfortable. And so you try to work to find the smallest piece of an atom that you can find. You try to work to explain how a Shakespeare text gets from the stage to a printed book. And even if there are several different versions of something, you try to like make this sort of unified theory about a text. And that I think ended up sort of underpinning a lot of the kind of work that we do, where we just were taught, we accepted the precepts that were taught to us. And if we question it, people would be like, why are you spending time wasting, um, don't waste time questioning things that are sort of set. Um, and that is exactly what was happening with folks who are working in pre-modern critical race studies as well. It would be, no, 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 there were not people of color in England in the 1580s. Don't worry about it. Not true. So if you have people who are like, well, I'm going to take time and sort of go back and think about whether or not there were people there, or whether or not sort of the definitions of like a good quarto or a bad quarto or any of this stuff is, um, that sort of makes you question everything. And so then I end up spending a lot of time just being like, well, do I even know what bibliography is? Do I even know what book history is? What are we doing? And why does it seem very, very similar to the kind of work that folks were doing 30 or 40 years ago in the history of race, and we're getting sort of stonewalled and told that that kind of work isn't possible, isn't probable. Um, and now everything's sort of being undone. Um, and for me, I think the first time I read a book by Paul Werstein, which was on the new bibliography and sort of the printing of Shakespeare plays, and he was like, "I'm going to question all of this." I felt so vindicated from the times when I was in grad school, where I was like, this seems a little bit like, at times it felt slightly um there was sort of a lot of rhetoric of race, there was a lot of rhetoric of like robots, there was a lot of rhetoric of science, and it all just felt kind of like eugenics. And I remember asking a professor kind of like, does this feel a little bit eugenicist? And he was like, no. And so I left it alone. But then once I sort of read Paul Werstein's book, I felt completely vindicated that it was okay to have an opinion about this. And so I think I don't know if I could give you an answer now, because I like rereading that work and being like, wow, I had an answer. Now I feel like I really don't know, and I'll spend the rest of my career, however long or short it is, thinking about what it means to do the kind of work that we do, and to try to do it as capaciously as possible. Um, I don't ever want to leave anyone or any history or anything out, which, will probably make my work slow down. Um, but without the kinds of questions that I ask, and definitely without the kinds of questions that you ask, um, we aren't doing a service to like the kind of thinking that we want to do. So, um, I guess I kind of want to ask you like a similar question, like what is book history to you? What is bibliography to you?
Yeah. So I think I'm sort of still in the process of throwing off the sort of the traditional analytical bibliography, because I was very much sort of my intellectual trajectory really was influenced by that.
Mm.
So one of my teachers, he worked for 20 years for the short title catalog Netherlands.
Wow.
So this was basically, so he saw 10,000 books and was making all these bibliographical descriptions. And sort of, so even during my master's, I was very much looking at the traditional bibliography. But now I think it's, for me, book history is, and that may seem like a sort of open door, but it is really sort of fundamentally about understanding how texts, and I mean text here in the very broad sense of the word, just as I think we both, when we talk about books, we mean lots of so there's a whole course I teach that called What is a Book, where I sort of open up the question. I think you will probably will doing the same. So what are we talking about when we talk about a book? But here, when we're talking about a book and a text, I think we both mean sort of communication in broad sense of the word. So how are they, so how are they made? How are they circulated? How are they received? And not just through their content, but also just very much through their material and formal life. And thinking about books as cultural objects, which are shaped by labor, by technology, by social context, that don't have a sort of static life, but evolve over time. And for me, it is very interdisciplinary. So it is a word nowadays we don't put in our grant application so much anymore, but it is history, it is literature, it is art, it is archival studies, and increasingly, fortunately, it's also questions of race and gender and colonialism. So, and that's also one of the great things about it, right? So that I also very much feel like we're in a sort of flux with book history as well, where there's this new generation looking at it from a different perspective, and maybe not totally throwing away the old, but very much questioning how can we go forwards, and don't answer questions like, no, there were no black people, there is no stuff like that. So yeah.
Well, this leads to some of these great questions we have here in the Q&A. In fact, you just kind of segued into Megan Heffernan's question, which is nice to hear from her here in Chicago. She writes, for both speakers, you're doing impressive work moving between capacious questions about ideology, as Trudy says, and the close, careful work of bibliography and textual materiality. This is field changing for both the history of the book and pre-modern critical race studies. It's also really challenging. So she says, what advice do you have for doing it? How do you approach the task of connecting the precise details of book production and use to the cultural meanings these practices hold? Big question.
But a great one. I think we both have to think
Yeah.
about that for a second, but it is a great question, actually.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I think the best way I can maybe start to answer this is by way of example. In the art of printing, Joseph Moxon, it's one of my favorite pieces of the printing. He has a printer's dictionary that gets appended onto the end of the art of printing, where he describes printers' devils. And printers' devils are, you have these like young boys who are helping out in the print shop. And Moxon says that they are forced, they're ordered to send sheets back and forth across the print shop. And because there's so much ink around, they get daubed with ink all over their bodies and they get called devils or flies, which the first time I read that, I didn't really think much about it. And then the second time I came back, I thought a lot about how devils and flies are it can be those descriptions can be pejoratives for Black and brown people. And it sort of stopped me in my tracks because then I started thinking, well, how many other metaphors about the act of printing um, then articulate um, structures of race and articulate things about race in this way. And once I started looking, I couldn't stop. And then if you think about every act of printing in which printing can, white paper gets sort of mapped onto racialized purity, or you get to the point where the act of pressing black ink onto white paper becomes the sort of sexual act between a black person and a white person. Um, as you read the text, it's like you can't sort of get that out of your head. And as you sort of think about the act of printing and um, the type of sort of scientific bibliographic work that we might do, I can't sort of separate the work of race um, from the work that takes place as you're trying to figure out whether or not a line from like a quarto of a play is works better or the same as a fully of the play. So for me, it's just always intertwined. I don't know if it's something that you can it's not something that you can sort of map on and just sort of do, but I think if we're constantly in conversation with one another, if something stops you in your tracks, talk to someone else and see what you think, see what they think. And I just think a lot more communal work, and sort of communities of scholars sort of openly discussing this material helps us to sort of come up with some kind of a way to do this kind of work. I hope that answered your question.
I also would like to add to that that there's, and I think you already sort of mentioned that working with people across sort of not so much disciplines, but more librarians, archivists, people that look at the material from a different way and can tell you a little bit more maybe about there's someone great working at the Municipal Archives in Amsterdam, Mark Ponte, who does really great work on making visible non-white people in Amsterdam in the early modern period. So that also sort of around the question of there were no black people, there couldn't have been black people in the printing shop, maybe. So and that are yeah, so archivists, librarians, they can also give you sort of answers to which maybe help our work as well. So yeah.
This actually leads to our next question from Jonathan Lamb. He says, thanks to you both for this lovely conversation. I'm curious to hear what you have to say about book history's role in tracking the formation of whiteness as a coordinate of urban European modernity. What does it look like to study bibliographically the development of a thing that is remarkably good at concealing its own histories? And Trudy just talking about, looking into the archive and finding the proof, I think is one way of responding to this question as well. It's great.
Well, thanks for that question, Jonathan. And I think this is where sort of studying and spending time working with scholars who focus on how whiteness works in the period really helps. I think that after recently reading Joyce McDonald's work on women and race in the early modern, um, and the ways in which whiteness does sort of get suppressed in text and deflects our attention away from it is something that's extremely and sort of extremely important to kind of constantly remember. I think I I think that it's very easy to focus on non-white people for evidence of non-white people or for evidence of um, printing as being compared to non-white people. But I don't know. I just always tend to kind of think once I find the non-white thing, I want to look for the white thing that is um, not quite the counterpart, but the thing that's sort of functioning alongside of it. Um, I would also maybe like to complicate this, thanks to the work of folks like Kyle Grady, who are interested in mixed race studies and the ways that it's very easy for us to create these false binaries um, of there's only sort of whiteness and blackness that gets manifested in the period, whether it's in print, whether it's in culture. Um, it's actually changed my work a lot because things that I wouldn't have really thought much about, like what if there are mixed race people working in the print industry? How do they get described by other folks? Um, how do people get like how does brownness get described? How does I think we want to be really careful about sort of limiting ourselves to like trying to figure out how whiteness gets structured and how blackness gets structured or how um, brownness gets structured or whatever. I think as we sort of move forward, we're going to see that there's a lot of articulation of mixedness and articulations of things that we perhaps didn't really think that early modern folks were thinking about. I think they were, and I think it actually is going to start to impact our work and sort of how we think about print, how we think about who is doing this work and who's appearing in the archives as well.
That's actually a great answer, Brandi. And I only would like to add here that perhaps we can also sort of open up the definition of book history in and of itself. So there's great work being done sort of in this. I think this relates in a way to the binary question of maybe in the early modern period, at least between white and black in that sense. There's this great article, I forgot the name, unfortunately, which considers wampum belts in North America as a kind of book history, not necessarily saying like this is a book, just as you could question like, is the Rosetta Stone a book, but sort of opening it up to a broader definition in and of itself. And so like we already mentioned, it's only fairly recent, right, that we acknowledge the history of print in Asia. So I hope that in a couple of years we consider all these different kinds of textual carriers as well within the field and have these conversations about how they work and how information was exchanged cross-culturally, but also within cultures in and of itself. So, yeah.
Great. We have two more questions that would be great if we could cover before we conclude. And they're questions that Chris and I are also thinking about as or actually texting each other about as we're listening. So Donna Long asks, Trudy noted that women and children and perhaps people of color did the coloring in early texts. Were early coloring substances, the inks and paints, safe to use or potentially toxic? Or was the employment not a privileged or highly paid one? And I think just building on this question, I would love to learn more about what sort of evidence we have for these laborers. And yeah, I know I've heard that at the Plantain Moretas, there's some documents.
Yeah.
I just want to know more. Yeah.
Yeah, great question. So we know very little about those colorists, and that all is Erasmus's fault, because Erasmus made the argument that Dürer's prints should be black and white, so no added color to them. And I think most art historians have really taken that to heart. So we're now at the point where very little research has been done on this hand coloring, because it sort of moves away from the original intention of the author. It moves away from, it's sort of, the argument was also that if you add color, it sort of does away with the clarity of the image, so etc. So there is very little information about this. And Leah, you rightfully mentioned the archives of the Plantain Moretus. I think they hold the answer to the question of the universe, actually, because they have so much information also about. So I spoke with Zanna van Loon, who is the curator there, and she told me that they found information in the so-called grootboeken on these people coloring, and mostly it's just Mary is doing the coloring. So very hard to sort of pin that to one particular person, but Trusje Goedings as well has done great research on this. So she looked at the Vago collection in Dublin and could pinpoint particular people doing that. And at this point, I think it's difficult to say whether this was a sort of high-ranking job. My initial instinct would be to say not per se. It was also something that women and children were encouraged to do at home as a sort of in the good household way of sort of occupying your time. Toxic materials, yes, very much so. But the whole business of printing is very toxic in general. Lots of lead, lots of mercury, stuff like that. Particularly I would say the pigments, lead mostly. So if you don't put it in your mouth, maybe you're all right. But it would be actually great to do a sort of history of vocational injuries in the printing industry. I think there's one actually from 1930 when there was still being printed basically, not basically, but comparably to the early modern period where people got sick. So yeah.
So Kristen Lehman, another somewhat local person here, has another good question for you about pedagogy. It's something we're also want to learn more about. Can you please share how you teach this important topic at your institutions? Also, do you offer credit-bearing courses on race and book history, or do you embed this topic within a book history course?
I can answer that. I haven't yet taught a course in race and book history. It's something that I would like to do. But in terms of just introducing concepts of book history and ways of looking at early material, I put it into every single class I teach, even the 200 level Introduction to Literature course. I teach a play by Philip Massinger called The Roman Actor, and I have students look at the title page and we think through who is the printer, who is the publisher, who the particular audience could be. We look at the fact that Philip Massinger wrote corrections into a few of the quartos of that play, and that helps students to sort of understand how a play gets from a performance to um, an audience of readers. And then we start to think about who those readers could be. And that's where we start to open up questions of who was living in London at the time. Could women read? were people of color around? Where could they have encountered this material? And I think that's how I think about it like blending vegetables into something to get your kids to eat them. It's kind of a way to sort of like introduce small concepts of book history. So by the end of the semester, there's a student who may come up and say, you know what, I really liked that small sort of thing that we did with the Roman actor. I really liked learning about how things got printed, or I really liked learning about marginalia. What else can you tell me about this? And I think that's kind of how I got introduced. So I'm trying to keep that alive with sort of experimental and experiential learning. So that it isn't sort of taught in a very sort of rote way, so that people find what interests them. And maybe they're not going to be necessarily interested in race and book history, but I hope that they find something within book history that's exciting for them.
Yeah, that's I think you're actually doing the good work, because I'm in the great position that I have so many book history courses I can teach, where it's basically up to me what I introduce. So it's, for me, it's more of a sort of set audience that I know is interested in these kinds of questions. And the head of our sort of the book history department is very small, but the head of it is she does a lot of work on the Dutch East Indies in the 19th century and how print culture works there. So it's yeah, I think that this is, yeah, it's really great. So I only teach with the books on the table. I can show them everything I like to, and quite a lot actually are interested in these types of topics. And I think every year more so. So now I have a new group of bachelor students, which I teach a course, The Power of the Written Word, and they have to come up with their own exhibition theme, and questions of race come into it every year more and more so. So I'm really optimistic for the future in that respect, at least.
That's great to hear. I think we're just about at time. And I should take this moment to thank you both for this wonderful conversation. We'll be thrilled to be able to put it online and share it with an even wider audience. And thanks to our audience here and for all these great questions. If we didn't get your question, I will make sure that Brandi and Trudy get it, and they can even respond via email. And I just wanted to note that this will be posted online and on our CRS YouTube page. This is the final conversation of this year. We'll be announcing next year's lineup very soon. So thank you both. We really appreciate your time, especially Trudy coming in from Amsterdam in the evening. Still very light out, which is
Yes,
lovely
it
to
is
see.
very light out
Yeah.
still. Yeah, it
So yeah,
takes a couple of hours. Yeah.
wonderful.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you. And we look forward to
Thank
future
you.
collaborations too.